One. We are live, ma'am.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Our lecture for today is pre-eclampsia and eclampsia. We have with us Dr. Swati Chhatrapati, Professor, Department of Anesthesiology, TNMC and BYL Nair Hospital. Now over to you, Dr. Swati.
Thank you, Sarita. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah,
yes, you are audible.
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah. As a part of the centenary year celebration of TNMC and BYL Nair Charitable Hospital, Anesthesia Department has organized a PG lecture series on obstetric anesthesia. And today's topic is anesthetic considerations in pre-eclampsia, eclampsia. Pre-eclampsia is a progressive multi-system disorder, and it is one of the leading causes of maternal and perinatal mortality. Anesthetist is an important member of a multidisciplinary team providing care to a pre-eclamptic patient. The role of anesthesiologist is just not limited to providing labor analgesia and providing anesthesia for cesarean section, but we are also involved in the resuscitation of eclamptic patient and post-op ICU care, including the management of ventilation, coagulopathy, and acute renal failure. So today's topic will include classification of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, pathophysiological changes, clinical features, anesthetic management, HELP syndrome, and management of hypertensive crisis. So hypertensive disorders in pregnancy are classified into gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, chronic hypertension with superimposed preeclampsia. Preeclampsia is further divided into with severe features and without severe features and severe features. So how do you define preeclampsia? It is a new onset of hypertension where systolic BP is more than 140 millimeters of mercury or diastolic BP of more than 90 millimeters of mercury on 2 occasions 4 hours apart after 20 weeks of gestation, and the new onset of one or more of the following features of end organ involvement. That is proteinuria more than 0.3 grams in 24-hour collection, or protein to creatinine ratio of more than 0.3 or more than 2 plus proteinuria on dipstick, or albumin creatinine ratio of more than 0.8. Platelet count less than 1 lakh per cubic millimeter, serum creatinine more than 1.1 milligram %, or if it is double from previous reading, elevated liver transaminases to twice normal, or if there is persistent epigastric or right upper quadrant pain, presence of pulmonary edema, or new onset cerebral or visual disturbances. So, preeclampsia is no longer a triad of hypertension, edema, and proteinuria. In 2013, ACOG removed proteinuria as the essential feature for the diagnosis of preeclampsia. Severe preeclampsia is presence of one or more of the following features, which are systolic BP more than equal to 160 millimeters of mercury or diastolic BP more than equal to 110 millimeters of mercury on 2 occasions at least 4 hours apart when patient is on bed rest. Thrombocytopenia, where platelet count is less than 1 lakh per cubic millimeter, impaired liver function, severe persistent epigastric or right upper quadrant pain, renal insufficiency, pulmonary edema, and new onset of cerebral or visual disturbances. So, oliguria, massive proteinuria, and IUGR are not considered as features of severe preeclampsia now. Gestational hypertension is maternal BP more than 140 by 90 millimeters of mercury after 20 weeks of gestation without proteinuria or other features of end organ dysfunction. And the BP usually comes back to normal within 12 weeks of postpartum period. Chronic hypertension is BP of more than 140 by 90 millimeters of mercury, which is present prior to conception or before 20 weeks of gestation. Proteinuria and features of end organ dysfunction may be present, but it continues beyond 12 weeks postpartum. And preeclampsia with preeclampsia superimposed on chronic hypertension is diagnosed when there is resistant or worsening hypertension with new onset or sudden increase in proteinuria and or new end organ dysfunction, and obviously it also continues beyond 12 weeks postpartum. So the risk factors associated with preeclampsia are elderly priming with family history of preeclampsia or history of preeclampsia in previous pregnancy, chronic hypertension, chronic renal disease, autoimmune diseases like antiphospholipid antibody syndrome or SLE, diabetes mellitus, increased trophoblastic mass, that is either in multiple gestation or vesicular mole, obesity, and vascular disease. Now, if you look at the etiopathogenesis of preeclampsia, genetic, vascular, environmental, and immunological, all of these factors are associated with etiopathogenesis. Basically, it is a two-stage disease. In stage 1, it is associated with abnormal placentation. And stage 2, the patient becomes symptomatic with full-fledged signs and symptoms of preeclampsia. Now, various pro-angiogenic and anti-angiogenic factors are secreted by developing placenta. So in normal pregnancy, there has to be balance between pro and anti-angiogenic factors so that there is establishment of smooth vascular network to supply oxygen and nutrients to the developing fetus. Now, what happens in preeclampsia? See, in healthy pregnancy, the trophoblastic cells, they will penetrate not only the endothelium of maternal spiral arteries, but they will also penetrate the muscular portion of the spiral arteries, thereby converting small caliber muscular arteries into large caliber capacitance vessels, which are non-responsive to vasomotor stimuli. Now, what happens in preeclampsia is the trophoblastic cells are penetrating only the endothelial layer, and they are not penetrating the myometrial, or you can say the tunica media of spiral arteries. So they continue to remain narrow and they are hyper responsive to vasomotor stimuli. So the ultimate result is placental hypoxia and oxidative stress. So placenta secretes various anti-angiogenic factors. The important ones are SFLT1 and soluble endocrine. So this results in generalized endothelial dysfunction and systemic inflammation leading to preeclampsia. Another theory is there is in normal pregnancy, there is balance between prostacyclin and thromboxane. But in preeclampsia, the balance tilts in favor of thromboxane. This results in decreased vasodilatation, decreased uteroplacental blood flow, and increased platelet aggregation. So the concept of starting aspirin as a prophylactic measure to prevent preeclampsia is based on this theory. Another way to classify preeclampsia is early onset and late onset. Early onset is type 1 preeclampsia, which is seen before 34 weeks of gestation, and it is seen in 10% of the parturients, and it is associated with poor maternal and fetal outcome. Late onset is also known as a type 2 preeclampsia. It is seen in 90% of patients, and it is further divided into preterm if it is diagnosed between 34 to 37 weeks of gestation, term if it is diagnosed between 37 to 42, and postpartum if it is diagnosed beyond 42 weeks of gestation. Now let us look at the pathophysiological changes in different organ systems. So if you look at the cardiovascular system, there is exaggerated response to circulating catecholamines leading to sympathetic overactivity and generalized vasospasm, which results in increased SVR, hypertension, and end organ ischemia. Plasma volume is reduced, and in severe disease, it is almost reduced up to 40%. This, along with increased capillary permeability, results in hemoconcentration, and there is activation of renal angiotensin aldosterone system, which results in sodium and water retention, resulting in extracellular edema. Proteinuria and increased capillary leak results in decreased colloid oncotic pressure. So when in normal pregnancy, it is 22 millimeters of mercury, in preeclamptic patient, it becomes 18 millimeters of mercury. Now, hemodynamic changes depend on the severity of disease, comorbidities, and the treatment received by the patient. So at one end of the spectrum, you have a patient with hyperdynamic LV function with increased cardiac output, mild to moderate increase in SVR, LV diastolic dysfunction, and low to normal right and left filling pressures. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, you have a patient with markedly increased SVR, markedly reduced intravascular volume, reduced LV function, and low cardiac output with increased filling pressures. There is poor correlation between right and left-sided pressures because of LV diastolic dysfunction, and CVP to PCWP gradient in severe preeclampsia may be as high as 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury. So what are the anesthetic implications of these cardiovascular changes? One is, after Neuraxial techniques, you can expect augmentation of hypotension, especially when the patient is receiving antihypertensive drugs and magnesium. There would be exaggerated response to laryngoscopy and tracheal intubation. One has to use vasopressors judiciously because you are expecting increased sympathetic response to vasopressors. Because of decreased circulating volume, anemia may be masked. Also, there is exaggerated response to iodo-cable compression because of reduced intravascular volume, and one has to remember to employ left uterine displacement. Patient cannot tolerate rapid administration of large fluid boluses. It is advisable to achieve a CVP of less than 4 to prevent pulmonary edema rather than blindly giving large fluid boluses. Also, albumin concentration is reduced, so the free active form of protein-bound drugs will be increased, and patient may not tolerate normal blood loss after LSCS. The incidence of pulmonary edema, which is a dreaded complication of preeclampsia, is 3%, and majority of cases are seen in postpartum period. The etiology is multifactorial, which include increased preload because of excessive IV fluid administration or resolving puerperial peripheral edema, increased afterload because of increase in systemic vascular resistance, reduced oncotic pressure, increased capillary permeability, or some associated cardiac causes like myopathic ventricle or associated valvular heart disease. Now, let us look at the changes in hematological system. Now, in the early stage of disease, the hypercoagulable state of normal pregnancy is exaggerated, and whereas towards the severe part or later part of the disease, the microangiopathic endothelial injury causes platelet activation, aggregation, and consumption, which leads to thrombocytopenia and hypocoagulable state. Now, thrombocytopenia is a marker of disease severity. Along with thrombocytopenia, patients also have qualitative platelet dysfunction due to degranulation of platelets. There is microangiopathic hemolysis, which causes increase in the indirect bilirubin and anemia. Now, if the patient has abruptio placentae, IUFD, severe liver involvement, maybe because of HELLP syndrome, or if there is PPH, then there are chances of DIC. And thrombosis, hemoconcentration, vasospasm, and ischemia, all these things will lead to end organ damage. So how do you come to know that the coagulation system is activated? One is there will be consumption of procoagulation factors, that is fibrinogen and platelets will be reduced. There will be increase in fibrinogen degradation products. On histopath, there will be microthrombi in organs, and there will be bleeding. So what are the implications? Why are we so worried? Why are we so concerned about a platelet count? That is because we want to decide whether the patient can receive neuraxial anesthesia or no. Basically, there are no guidelines for safe platelet count for neuraxial anesthesia. So when you are planning to give epidural or spinal anesthesia, in addition to looking at the absolute platelet count, the trend is very important, and the coexisting coagulopathy, especially if the patient is having the risk factors, which I previously mentioned, like if there is PPH, if there is IUFD, if there is severe liver involvement, and further coagulation studies must be assessed. Now, platelet count more than 1 lakh is safe for neuraxial anesthesia, and one has to avoid neuraxial anesthesia if platelet count is less than 50,000. So 50 to 70,000 is a gray zone, and decision is to be taken after assessing risk-benefit ratio. Now, it is important to note that clot strength also declines rapidly when platelet count is less than 80,000 per cubic millimeter. So if platelet count is more than 75,000, it is stable, or if there is a slow downward trend for 2 to 3 weeks without clinical evidence of bleeding, then regional anesthesia can be given with close follow-up for signs of epidural hematoma. Now, it is reasonable to have platelet count within 6 hours of performing a neuraxial anesthesia, and in the early epidural catheter insertion is recommended in patients with declining platelet count and those with difficult airway. Now, the guidelines say that platelet function analysis is more sensitive to coagulation dysfunction than TEG, but its utility to predict risk for epidural hematoma requires further study. Glucocorticoids are not effective for raising platelet count. Transfusion of platelets to allow neuraxial anesthesia is not recommended, and one has to follow same protocols for removal of epidural catheter also. So why are we so concerned about the platelet count is we have to identify the risk of the patient developing vertebral canal hematoma. Now, the incidence of this is 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 250,000 in thrombocytopenic obstetric patient, which is less than 0.6% risk. Now, it is if the patient develops vertebral canal hematoma, then patient will have sensory motor deficit, and it is associated with poor prognosis unless decompressive laminectomy is done within 8 hours of a patient developing signs and symptoms. On the other hand, the incidence of serious complications like intracranial hemorrhage and failed intubation, which are there with general anesthesia, is 6.5%. So, how to make neuraxial anesthesia safer in thrombocytopenic patient? Like if the patient is having a platelet count of 54,000 and it has been stable for past 6 hours, then how can you predict the risk of developing vertebral canal hematoma? One is the tests like APTT, PT. They are not predictive. They are not predictive of bleeding unless the platelet count falls below 20,000. And also other viscoelastic test and PFA. They also have insufficient evidence to predict the risk of bleeding into the vertebral canal. So what one can do is the skilled anesthesiologist should give single shot spinal with fine needle, and one has to check for neurological signs and symptoms of patient developing vertebral canal hematoma. If at all patient develops these signs, then urgent neurosurgery consultation should be sought, and decompressive laminectomy must be performed within 8 hours, and platelet count has to be repeated before epidural catheter removal. Now, signs and symptoms associated with respiratory system are pharyngolaryngeal edema and facial edema, which causes difficulty in mask ventilation and tracheal intubation. Patient may give history of obstructive sleep apnea. There are increased chances of bleeding with airway instrumentation. Oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is shifted to left. So there is reduced oxygen availability to fetus. Because of microthrombi in pulmonary circulation, there will be ventilation perfusion mismatch, and there are high chances of ARDS. So what are the anesthetic implications? One is to be prepared to manage difficult airway. In fact, guidelines say that video laryngoscopy may be used as a first line laryngoscope to improve the chances of successful intubation. And airway edema may worsen over the course of labor. So the Balamapatti classification also has to be examined just before you induce the patient or just before giving general anesthesia. Changes associated with renal system are proteinuria, which is because of increased glomerular permeability and decreased tubular reabsorption. Glomerular endotheliosis and renal artery vasospasm causes 30 to 40% reduction in GFR, which results in increased uric acid and serum creatinine concentration. Serum uric acid is again a marker of severity. Patient is said to be having oliguria if urine output is less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour for 2 consecutive hours. Preeclamptic patients have increased chances of going into acute renal failure, which could be because of pre-renal causes like hypovolemia and renal artery vasospasm, or renal causes which are again divided into acute tubular necrosis due to prolonged renal hypoperfusion or bilateral renal cortical necrosis. Now, if ARF is because of pre-renal or ATM, it resolves completely after delivery. But if the patient develops ARF due to renal cortical necrosis, then patient can go into CRF and she can become dialysis dependent. So the anesthetic implications are if serum creatinine is more than 1.1 mg%, it indicates severe spectrum of the disease. Renal elimination of drugs are affected, and oliguria will further compound the problems of intravascular fluid therapy. Changes in the hepatic system range from mild hepatocellular dysfunction to HELLP syndrome, subcapsular hematoma, and hepatic rupture. Now, HELLP syndrome is a clinical entity associated with hemolysis, elevated liver enzyme levels, and low platelets. So, laboratory tests to diagnose HELLP syndrome are abnormal peripheral smear, increased bilirubin levels more than 1.2 mg%, increased LDH more than 600 international units per liter, increased AST more than 70 IU per liter, and platelet count less than 1 lakh per cubic millimeter. Patient with HELLP syndrome can develop complications like DIC, abruptio placentae, ARF, pulmonary edema, ARDS, subcapsular hematoma in the liver, liver rupture leading to cardiovascular collapse, and liver failure. So the anesthetic considerations in patients with HELLP syndrome would be, one has to manage coagulopathy with blood and blood products. Because of thrombotic microangiopathy and hemoglobinuria, patient may go into ARF requiring dialysis, impaired drug metabolism and excretion because of hepatic and renal involvement can be there. Because of massive hemolysis and renal dysfunction, patient can develop hyperkalemia. If patient is in hepatic failure, she can go into hypoglycemia, so blood sugar monitoring will be required. In case of hepatic rupture, patient will have circulatory collapse, and if the patient has developed ARDS, then post-op ventilative support may be required. Signs and symptoms of central nervous system would include headache, hyperexcitability, hyperreflexia, seizures, visual disturbances, cerebral hemorrhage, and coma. The basic pathogenesis is endothelial disruption with loss of cerebral autoregulation. So patient may have vasoconstriction and ischemia or there could be forced vasodilatation with hyperperfusion of brain leading to vasogenic edema. This is most commonly seen in posterior circulation, and it represents a form of posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. Stroke is a leading cause of death in preeclamptic patient, and incidence is directly proportional to systolic hypertension, which is usually systolic hypertension above 160 should not be allowed. Now, the predictors of disease severity are optic nerve sheath diameter. If it is more than 5.8 millimeters, then it indicates severe disease, and regional cerebral hemoglobin oxygen saturation, which is reduced in preeclamptic patients. Uteroplacental perfusion, the severity, the fetal jeopardy can be assessed based on the fetal umbilical artery waveform when there is increased downstream resistance, when there is decreased diastolic flow velocity, and when there is increase in the ratio of systolic flow to diastolic flow velocity, and when there is high uterine artery perstillity index with uterine artery notching. So all these may be associated with IUGR. Now, the causes of maternal morbidity and mortality in preeclampsia are eclampsia, HELP syndrome, intracranial hemorrhage, CCF with pulmonary edema, pulmonary aspiration of gastric contents, abruptio placentae with DIC, PPH, ARF, septic shock, myocardial infarction, and retinal injury. And causes of fetal morbidity and mortality are prematurity, IUGR, low birth weight babies, and IUFT. Now, about anti-hypertensive therapy, the advantages of starting this therapy are there is decreased risk of maternal complication related to severe hypertension like intracranial hemorrhage, hypertensive encephalopathy, myocardial ischemia, CCF, renal injury, or renal failure. But the disadvantages are some of the drugs might have adverse effects on fetus, and sudden hypotension may have effect on uteroplacental circulation also. And lowering BP does not affect progress of preeclampsia, neither does it improve the fetal outcome. Now, the international guidelines vary with respect to threshold for starting treatment and targeted BP goals. And in general, all the values of blood pressure are higher than the guidelines for non-obstetric hypertensive patients. Again, the doses and when to start the therapy will depend on maternal comorbidities. Now, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, atenolol, spironolactone, and direct renin inhibitors are contraindicated during pregnancy. Now, as per ACOG guidelines, antihypertensive treatment is started when systolic BP is more than 160, or if diastolic BP is more than 105, without evidence of end-organ damage. And according to them, one is to maintain BP between 120 to 160 systolic and 80 to 105 diastolic. Now, as per European guidelines, antihypertensives have to be started when BP is more than 140/90 with gestational hypertension or chronic hypertension with subclinical organ damage or symptoms. And as per NICE guidelines, treat BP, high BP, only if it is more than 150/100 millimeters of mercury. In general, you can keep systolic BP between 140 to 150, diastolic between 90 to 100, and MAP between 105 to 125 millimeters of mercury. Now, the most common agents used for treating preeclampsia in the antenatal period are labetalol, nifedipine, extended release, and alpha-methyl dopa. Labetalol is a combined alpha and beta agonist with the ratio of 1:7. It has to be avoided in patients with conduction abnormalities, systolic heart failure, and asthma. Extended release, when the patient is receiving extended release nifedipine capsules, there could be exaggerated cardiovascular depression caused by inhalational agents. One should never use sublingual nifedipine because there could be sudden hypotension which can compromise uteroplacental circulation. Alpha-methyl dopa is a centrally acting alpha agonist. When the patient is on alpha-methyl dopa, you can expect decreased MAC of inhalational agents, increased sensitivity to direct vasopressors. It can cause liver damage. It may be associated with hemolytic anemia, positive Coombs test, and postnatal depression. Now, what is acute severe hypertension? Acute severe hypertension, again, the guidelines vary. Some say if it is more than 160 by 110, some say if it is more than 180 by 110, but the guideline is reduce MAP by not more than 15 to 25%. Target systolic BP should be 120 to 160. Target diastolic is 85 to 105. So what all drugs are used to treat acute severe hypertension? Most common are labetalol, hydralazine, and nifedipine immediate release. Hydralazine is not available with us. So we usually use labetalol in the dose of 10 to 20 milligram IV. It can be repeated every 10 minutes by doubling dose 20 to 80 milligram, and maximum is up to 300 milligrams. It can be also started in the infusion form as 1 to 2 milligram per minute. It can cause neonatal bradycardia. Nifedipine immediate release capsules have to be given orally. The onset of action is 5 to 10 minutes. 10 milligram can be repeated every 20 minutes up to a maximum dose of 50 milligrams. It is associated with maternal symptoms of headache, palpitation, and there could be precipitous fall in BP. So regular monitoring of fetal heart rate is recommended. It is contraindicated in coronary artery disease, long-standing diabetes, aortic stenosis. Other drugs that can be used are esmolol. The onset of action is within 1 minute, and it is to be given in the dose of 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg, followed by infusion of 50 to 200 microgram per kg per minute. It can cause transient fetal bradycardia and hypoglycemia. NTG in the dose of 5 microgram per minute. It is associated with raised ICP, but it is a drug of choice if the patient has pulmonary edema. Now, magnesium sulfate is a drug of choice for prophylaxis as well as for treatment of seizures in eclamptic patients. The mechanism of action is it raises the seizure threshold by antagonism of NMDA receptors, decreases blood-brain barrier permeability, thereby reducing cerebral edema. It causes vasodilatation of cerebral blood vessels, thereby improving cerebral ischemia, reduces SVR by arteriolar vasodilatation, and reduces acetylcholine transmission in motor nerve terminals. It is contraindicated in patients with myasthenia, and one has to be cautious in patients with hypocalcemia, moderate to severe ARF, cardiac ischemia, heart block, and myocarditis. Magnesium sulfate regime, it can be given either intravenous or intramuscular. Intravenous 4 to 6 grams of 50% solution is given over 15 to 20 minutes, followed by maintenance dose of 1 to 2 grams per hour. Intramuscular, it is given in the dose of 5 grams of 50% solution into each buttock, total 10 grams, followed by 5 grams intramuscularly every 4 hours. Now, if seizures continue in spite of patient being on magnesium sulfate, you can give phenytoin 15 milligrams per kg, or diazepam 10 milligram, or thiopentone 50 milligram. And in the scenario of resistant seizures, you have to use muscle relaxant and intubate the patient. Now, what are the beneficial effects of magnesium sulfate? It attenuates endothelial dysfunction by reducing platelet aggregation and increasing the production of prostacyclin. It also attenuates pressure response to laryngoscopy, and by producing tocolysis, it improves uterine blood flow. But what are the detrimental effects? There is reduced fetal heart rate variability and reduced fetal heart rate. It increases sensitivity to non-depolarizing muscle relaxants, reduces muscle tone in the newborn, and there could be maternal nausea, vomiting, headache, visual disturbances, palpitation, and muscle weakness. Now, what are the drug interaction between MEC-self and non-depolarizing muscle relaxant? There is prolongation of effect of non-depolarizers. How? By inhibiting the presynaptic release of acetylcholine, by sensitization of postsynaptic receptors to acetylcholine, and it also depresses the excitability of muscle fiber membrane. So the therapeutic levels of magnesium sulfate are 1.8 to 3 millimoles per liter. Patellar reflex is lost at 3.5 to 5 millimoles per liter. There is respiratory paralysis at 5 to 6.5 millimoles per liter. Altered cardiac conduction at levels more than 7.5 and cardiac arrest at levels above 12.5 millimoles per liter. So when the patient is on magnesium sulfate, one has to monitor patellar reflex, urine output, and respiration, because magnesium sulfate is excreted predominantly by the kidneys. Now, in the event of toxicity, one can use intravenous 10 cc 10% calcium gluconate slowly, manage airway, diuretics 5 to 10 milligram Lasix can be given. If you don't have calcium gluconate, you can also use 10% calcium chloride 5 to 10 ml. But it is, if you give it through the peripheral veins, then it is irritable and it causes tissue necrosis. Now, if the patient is already on magnesium infusion, then it is recommended to continue magnesium infusion intraoperatively, because half-life of magnesium is 5 hours. So by stopping the infusion just before taking up the patient for section is not going to be beneficial with respect to non-inhalational, non-depolarizing muscle relaxant effect. On the contrary, you will be exposing the patient to more seizures in the postoperative period. Magnesium also potentiates the hypotension by regional anesthesia, so one has to be careful. And nifedipine and magnesium sulfate can be used together safely without adverse effect in mother or fetus. Now, what about invasive hemodynamic monitoring? Radial artery cannulation is indicated when the patient has persistent severe hypertension, which is refractory to treatment. If you're planning to use rapid acting vasodilators like NTG, SNP to control BP, if there is need for frequent blood sampling and ABG monitoring, like if the patient is obtunded, if the patient has just had seizures, or if you think that the patient will go on postoperative ventilator. For use of calculated systolic pressure variation or stroke volume variation to estimate intravascular volume status, continuous BP monitoring during induction and emergence from GA in severe preeclamptic patient, and for use of minimally invasive cardiac output to guide hemodynamic management. CVP monitoring and PCWP monitoring recently has gone out of fashion because there are increased complications associated with insertion of these lines. There are no randomized trials to support its use. Also, there is poor correlation between CVP and PCWP, and we have now revised guidelines for fluid management. So you will insert CVP catheter only if there is difficult peripheral venous access, if you're planning to administer vasoactive drugs, as an estimation of preload in presence of oliguria, or if the patient is in pulmonary edema, or to follow a trend in blood loss, or if the patient is having comorbidities. So the non-invasive tools for hemodynamic monitoring are being used now, like transthoracic echocardiography or transesophageal echocardiography, which can monitor cardiac function, volume status, and it can help us in guiding the fluid management. Lung ultrasonography can pick up the early signs of pulmonary edema, like interstitial edema, and pulse waveform analysis. Now, fluid management has to be individualized, either based on markers of end organ perfusion, like urine output, mental status, and pH and lactate levels. Or if you have a sophisticated tools like USG, then point of care bedside USG can be done, like lung USG can pick up the interstitial edema and diagnose pulmonary edema, and transthoracic echocardiography, also known as a ROSE scan, which is rapid obstetric screening echo, which can diagnose ventricular volume status, and it will help us in guiding the fluid therapy. Now, as far as fluid management in severe pre-eclamptic is concerned, there are no maternal or fetal benefits of colloids over crystalloids. Pulmonary edema because of colloid overload is less amenable to diuretics. So it is better to resort to only crystalloids. When you're planning labor analgesia, no fluid boluses are required for initiation of labor analgesia. In fact, even for neuraxial anesthesia, restrictive co-loading is recommended. That is, which should be limited to less than 500 ml. And intraoperatively, conservative intraoperative fluid administration should be done, that is 80 to 100 ml per hour, which should be excluding bleeding. And oliguria, which does not respond to a modest fluid challenge of 300 ml, should be accepted, and further fluids should be CVP guided or USG guided. Pre-anesthetic assessment should include the clinical parameters like airway examination or target organ involvement, which will tell you about the disease severity, maternal hemodynamics, fluid balance, and coagulation status. Laboratory investigations must include CBC, hematocrit, platelet count, BUN serum creatinine, uric acid levels, LFTs, serum electrolytes, urine for proteinuria and hematuria, coagulation assay if patient has associated problems like IUFDs, PPH, where there are chances of patient going into DIC, ABG if patient is in shock, or if she is in a post-ictal state, and grouping cross matching. Now, you may be asked in the exam, like if the urine dipstick for protein, if it is 1 plus, then how much proteinuria is there? So 1 plus corresponds to 0.3 grams per liter, 2 plus corresponds to 1 grams per liter, and 3 plus corresponds to 3 grams per liter. What are the different ways to assess the fetal well-being? These are cardiotocogram, then USG examination to find out the amniotic fluid volume, weight of the patient, biophysical profile, umbilical artery, Doppler blood flow, where if the pulsatility index is more than 2 standard deviation, or if the umbilical artery blood flow is reversed, or if it is absent, then you can say that the fetus is in jeopardy. Now, what are the uses of USG in pre-eclamptic patient? It can be used to assess the airway, gastric volume, optic nerve sheath diameter, vascular access if patient has generalized edema, to give neuraxial blocks, and lung USG to guide fluids. What are the benefits of regional anesthesia during labor? Is it gives very high quality analgesia, which attenuates hypertensive response to labor pain and all the other complications associated with hypertension, like pulmonary edema, intracranial hemorrhage, congestive cardiac failure, myocardial infarction. It gives superior pain relief as compared to systemic analgesics, reduces circulating catecholamines and stress-related hormones. It improves uteroplacental blood flow. Neonatal acid-base status is better with the patient receiving regional anesthesia as compared to systemic opioids, and it can be used for rapid conversion to surgical anesthesia. Now, lumbar epidural regional analgesia can be given either in the form of intermittent boluses or as continuous infusion, or patient-controlled epidural analgesia, or as combined spinal epidural. Now, there is controversy regarding epidural test dose containing adrenaline in pre-eclamptic patient. Some authors advocate that adrenaline can be used without adverse effects in preeclampsia. Whereas few authors, they do not recommend because of fear of severe hypertension and reduced uteroplacental blood flow in the event of inadvertent intravascular injection. And some authors say that if the patient is on beta blockers, then there will not be a tachycardic response if there is an intravascular injection of adrenaline. So it is recommended to use alternate test dose solutions like fentanyl or air. Now, neuraxial anesthesia for emergency cesarean section in preeclamptic patients is a preferred anesthesia technique in the absence of fetal or maternal compromise. That is without cord prolapse, significant placental abruption with hypovolemia or maternal cardiorespiratory distress. So spinal, epidural and CSC, all three are safe depending on the urgency of surgery and time available. What are the advantages? Avoids all the problems associated with GA, that is difficult airway, exaggerated hypertensive response to intubation and extubation, drug interaction between magnesium and non-depolarizers, and risk of aspiration. Now, what about spinal anesthesia and severe preeclampsia? The literature supports its safety in severe preeclamptic patients. In fact, there is lower incidence of hypotension and vasopressor requirement as compared to normal parturients. It is short-lived and it is easily treated because there is increased production of circulating factors with potent pressor effects in severe preeclamptic patients. They have increased sensitivity to vasopressor drugs, and they usually have small for gestation babies. And it has been found that there is no significant difference in neonatal outcome when severe preeclamptic patients were given GA, epidural, and or spinal anesthesia. Now, what about the hypotension? What about the requirement of vasopressors? So there is no significant difference in maternal and neonatal outcome between phenylephrine and ephedrine. So both are equally safe and effective. They have to be administered in low incremental dose, titrated to the effect based on maternal hemodynamics. And a recent strategy is to start prophylactic titrated low dose infusion with the rescue boluses to maintain BP near baseline or less than 160 millimeters of mercury. So phenylephrine can be given in the dose of 25 to 50 microgram boluses or in the infusion form as less than 50 microgram per minute. And ephedrine can be given in the boluses of 2.5 to 5 milligram and in the infusion of 1 to 5 milligrams per minute. Major concerns with general anesthesia are difficult or failed airway due to oropharyngeal edema, risk of aspiration, sympathoadrenal response during intubation and extubation, hypotension from anesthetic-induced reduction in cardiac output and SVR, and drug interaction between medself and non-depolarizers. So what should be the ideal technique for general anesthesia? Be prepared for a difficult airway. So small size tubes, video laryngoscopes, FRUA, bougie, fiber optic bronchoscope, depending upon the level of difficulty. Blunt the pressure response to intubation with labetalol or lignocaine or esmolol, NTG, fentanyl, remifentanil, Maxelf. Quick laryngoscopy and avoid multiple attempts, or use peripheral nerve stimulator to guide the dose of muscle relaxants, use titrated dose of inhalational agents, avoid methyl ergonovin, administer prostaglandins for PPH unresponsive to oxytocin in small bolus doses with the rule of 3. Take care of pressure response during extubation and extubate the patient when she's fully awake. So the doses of drugs used to reduce the pressure response are lignocaine can be given in the dose of 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg IV, labetalol 10 milligram IV boluses up to 1 milligram per kg, esmolol 2 milligram per kg or 1 mg per kg with lidocaine, Mexel 30 to 40 mg per kg, NTG 1.5 to 2.5 mics per kg, fentanyl 1 to 3 mics per kg IV. So if you are using opioid, then there are chances of neonatal respiratory depression. So facilities for neonatal resuscitation must be available. Now, what about eclamptic patient? One is coagulation studies are always required when you're planning neuraxial anesthesia, regardless of platelet count. Now, if the eclamptic patient, if she is conscious and alert with controlled seizures without signs of raised ICP and coagulopathy, you can consider regional anesthesia. But in the case of unconscious, obtunded patient with evidence of raised ICP, consider GA, opioid relaxant inhalational agent, and deliberate hyperventilation like neuroanesthesia. Extubate only if patient is fully conscious, and continue IPPV if there is raised ICP, and you can take a neurosurgery consultation if there is prolonged unconsciousness. Causes of delayed awakening after general anesthesia are effect of excess anesthetic agents or opioid, hypoglycemia, magnesium, resulting either in inadequate reversal of neuromuscular block or respiratory depression, or if there is some intracranial event. In such a case, one has to check for pupils, response, and emergency CT scan has to be advised. Now, in the postpartum period, patient has to be monitored in PACU. The chances of pulmonary edema, stroke, venous thromboembolism, airway obstruction, and seizures are there in the postoperative period. So you have to be very careful. Antihypertensive drugs and magnesium has to be continued in the post-op period. Restrict IV fluids till diuresis occurs. Analgesia can be given in the form of neuraxial or systemic opioids, TAB block, quadratus lumborum block, or wound infiltration, paracetamol. NSAIDs again uses controversial because of exaggerated hypertensive response, but recent literature supports safe use of NSAID in postpartum period in the absence of platelet dysfunction and renal insufficiency. So to conclude, successful management of pre-eclamptic patient requires good team effort. An anesthesiologist, by donning her cap as a perioperative physician, plays a pivotal role in the multidisciplinary team, ensuring safe journey of mother and fetus. Thank you. So can we have a MCQ? Sarita?
Yes, please go ahead.
So MCQ1 is which is not a risk factor for preeclampsia? Molar pregnancy, multigravida, age less than 20 years, multiple pregnancy, and family history. So in this case, multigravida would be the answer. Severe preeclampsia is defined as any one of diastolic blood pressure more than 100, oliguria less than 400 in 24 hours, pulmonary edema, platelet count less than 1 lakh, and proteinuria of more than 5 grams per 24 hours. So A and E would be the answer for this question. Magnesium used in the treatment of preeclampsia crosses the placenta and can result in fetal hypotonia, potentiates the non-depolarizing muscle relaxants, is eliminated in urine, causes uterine stimulation, and may be antagonized by IV calcium. So, which is the false statement here is it causes uterine stimulation. Magnesium causes uterine relaxation and it improves the uterine blood flow. With regards to Delivery for women with preeclampsia, a platelet count of less than 1 lakh is considered as absolute contraindication. General anesthesia is safe option for delivery. Remifentanil 1 mics per kg can be given to obtain the hypertensive response to intubation. Short-acting opioids should also be given prior to extubation. And hypotension with regional anesthesia is more profound in severe preeclamptic patients. So wrong statement would be A, B, and E. When considering use of regional anesthesia in a woman with preeclampsia, which statement is true? Anesthetists worry about causing bleeding around the spinal cord. Use of low-dose aspirin is contraindicated to regional. Neuraxial anesthesia impairs blood flow to the fetus, and neuraxial hematoma can occur upon removal of the epidural catheter. So true will be A and D. Theory questions could be HELP syndrome, Maxwell therapy, pathophysiological changes, and management of acute severe hypertension. Discuss the problems involved in managing such a case. Thank you.
Dr. Varun, are there questions in the chat box?
No, ma'am.
Yeah.
No question in the
No
chat
question.
box.
Can we end the session?
Okay.
Yes, I think Swati, that was extremely informative and wonderful lecture. I'm
Yeah.
sure whoever attended must have really liked it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati.
Thank you.
Sarita, you can wind up the program.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Swati. Very nice lecture. And Varun, tomorrow will you send another link for the speaker? Or can we have the same link? I think I'll ask Varun tomorrow. It's okay. We'll end the session.
Same link will be there, ma'am.
Same link as today. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.